Hi, everybody. It is Teacher at Home. Today, I'd actually like to take a moment to talk about some of the struggles that are going on in our urban schools, in our inner city schools. Now, I'd like to begin by saying that there are a tremendous number of dedicated professionals who serve their entire lives in inner city schools and who will dedicate 20, 25 years to one school and really invest themselves into helping their community. Often those teachers grew up in the same community or communities very similar and are giving back. And so when I talk about some of the issues that are facing these schools, let's be really clear that um, you can't talk about these schools without recognizing that there are teachers who dedicate decades to improving the lives of the kids and the students in their communities. Um, so let's put that in its box and say that right now I'm not going to address them because those people who are magnificent, okay, are also a limited number of professionals. So before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about some of the aspects of teaching that the people who are in the business know and perhaps parents don't know. And so the very first thing I would like to bring up is the idea of turnover. Now, turnover is a phrase that's used to describe how many teachers leave a school every year and how many new teachers need to be hired. Now, when you get into the urban schools, those numbers are pretty high. So they might be 15, 20%, maybe one out of five teachers, and in certain areas, it might be up to 30% of turnover, meaning teachers are going to have to be replaced constantly. Now, why? Well, there are a number of reasons. The first reason is burnout. Teachers burn out. In fact, I believe the statistics say about one out of every three or four teachers burns out after 3 years. They realize that the commitment of time and stress is overwhelming, and the rewards may or may not be um, worth it for those individuals. So there's burnout, and so there are a surprising number of teachers who leave the profession after 3 years. I myself had to leave after 4 years. I was burnt out, but I came back to it. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad teacher if you just get burnt out and overwhelmed. And there are countless reasons that might be that have nothing to do with the kids themselves. It might have to do with district policies, administrators, what have you. Um, so teacher burnout is a very big issue. Another element that impacts turnover are, teachers get married, they get pregnant, they relocate, and so that will take out a certain number of teachers. And then lastly, there are the teachers who move up into administration. Now, I can't really speak to the rest of the country, but in Los Angeles Unified School District, if you're going to move up to be an administrator, there's a process. That process can only begin after you've spent 3 years in the classroom. So a teacher might be teaching for 3 years and then move into an out of the classroom position, such as a magnet coordinator, a Title I coordinator, or a testing coordinator, or some sort of job that is a semi administrative job. They're not quite an administrator because in Los Angeles, to be an administrator, you have to have at least 1 year out of the classroom as you move up. So the people who go into education with an eye towards um, moving up throughout the system, teacher, coordinator, assistant principal, principal, um, possibly a director working for a district, ultimately, and maybe an assistant superintendent, and possibly even a superintendent of a school. The people who have those kinds of career plans, they enter as teachers also when they move up. And some people just move up and are fine as assistant principals. I knew someone who was an assistant principal for 20 years. They had no desire to take that next step to become a principal. The pay is better, although the hours are longer and the responsibilities are greater in terms of legal paperwork and stuff like that. But there are people who enter the educational system with an eye towards moving up the quote unquote corporate ladder. So there are teachers who leave after 3 years to achieve their professional goals. So besides the burnout, besides the teachers who leave because of personal issues, perhaps marriage or pregnancy or relocating, um, the people who move up for their professional careers, there's also people who leave because after they serve 3 years in an urban school, they may decide that they're ready to move to a quote unquote better neighborhood. It might be a school closer to where they went to school themselves or where they grew up themselves. It might be a relocation to another state. For all of these reasons, and I'm sure there are more that I'm not talking about, this creates a system of teacher turnover, which means in specifically the urban schools, where you have a high rate of turnover, you end up consistently cycling through the newest teachers. So what does that mean? Well, look, maybe I'm a slow learner. I thought I was a good teacher when I started. In my first 3 years when I was teaching, I was I was a pretty good teacher, but I wasn't a great teacher, and I certainly didn't have the chops that I have after 20 years in the industry. And on top of that, there are just things you don't know. There's a whole process of maturation that goes on with teachers. And so when you have the teachers who've been teaching for 20, 25 years, going on 30 years, the quality of those teachers, what they bring to the classroom, the depth of their knowledge, their ability to um, diagnose struggles that students have and their tool belt and the extensive different tools that they have to use to help students in a variety of situations, all of that stuff um, simply makes them better teachers. And it's honestly harder to keep those teachers in these inner city urban schools. It's just harder to retain the teachers. Um, and that goes in every school, but when you get into a higher performing school in a safer neighborhood, it's a little bit easier to retain the teachers than when you're in the urban neighborhood and you have all these other issues going on that people have to face. So if you have a teacher in an urban neighborhood who did not grow up in that neighborhood, the likelihood that they're going to move somewhere else and change schools, I believe, is relatively high. So, what that means is that the kids who attend these urban schools, especially the elementary school level kids, they're always cycling through the newest teachers with the narrowest tool belts and the least experience as far as diagnosing problems and being able to deal with them and understanding how to work with parents who are stressed and who are angry and um, how do you help the kids and how do you manage your time to be effective. They're also still developing their curriculum, and that the demands on a new teacher are extensive as they are learning their craft, practicing their craft, developing their actual classroom techniques and classroom management techniques. All of these things are going on with new teachers at the same time. So when you have a school that is heavily impacted by the fact that they simply have the newest teachers all the time. Often they have to train these teachers on the job while they come in. You're going to have student outcomes that are not achieving at the levels that you like. And then you throw on top of this district mandates, which change every 3 years, and force teachers to do a variety of different things. And the stress level gets pretty high. So when you're in the urban inner city schools, and I really want to focus on elementary schools for a minute, when you have this high rate of turnover, um, that really does have a huge impact, especially when you're talking about the foundation, the base foundation of what kids need to know, um, the multiplication tables, division, math, and now with Common Core, which is a whole different animal. Um, what does Common Core mean, and how do the new teachers even learn how to teach Common Core if your school district uses the Common Core curriculum, which is some sort of new math that um, is based on an entirely different philosophy of math, and has its many issues. Okay, so um, given all of these factors, the urban schools are faced with, they basically are starting out behind the eight ball. And this continues because don't forget, after elementary school, you get into middle school, and now you're talking about, 11, 12, 13 year olds who start to go through puberty. And besides the puberty that they're going through, which if you're a parent, you totally know how crazy that is. But then throw in the fact that some of these kids are starting out struggling in school, and I'll talk about the teachers in a minute, and what the teachers are coping with. And then you also have the social stresses from the community, which might involve introductions to dangerous behaviors, such as drug use or more mature interactions with kids of various genders. And so that is also a factor that really plays in heavily. And in the urban schools, where there is kind of a lot of social pressure towards maturity, peer pressure for the kids to be really super mature, and exposure to a variety of media that embraces that mature kid aspect. Then you start to get those other things, like even Disney. If you watch the Disney Channel, these kids have girlfriends and boyfriends. And we're talking about 12 and 13-year olds who are just going through puberty. And, just a year or two ago, they were in elementary school, they're little babies. And now they're here and they have all these pressures, and it's kind of wacky before they even get to high school. So, um, elementary school, we're putting that aside. Um, and then you get to middle school, and there's something that happens in middle school that parents are really not aware of. And that's the shift from sixth grade to seventh grade. Now, again, I can only speak to California, but in California, the teachers have different licenses. So I am somebody who is licensed to teach seventh grade through adult learners. Those are my people, okay? The youngest kid that I am licensed to work with is seventh grade, and I can teach adults. I have that license that means I can professionally take those jobs. The other professional license in California is basically pre K through sixth grade. So imagine those nurturing, kind, loving teachers that you have in elementary school, right? And the techniques they have to work with the younger kids, and you bring those all the way into the first year of middle school. So sixth grade teachers are still the same professionals that would have worked with them in fifth grade or fourth grade or second grade. They have the same license. They often use the same kind of skill sets, and they have often that same kind of nurturing, loving mentality that's really great. But then kids get into the seventh grade and they have a whole different brand of teacher. The teacher looks at them and says, wow, you're 12 years old. You've been in school for, 7 or 8 years. You know the deal. The expectations ramp up. And there's a huge shift in how those teachers treat the students, how they react to the students, because the students are suddenly moving up and are expected to enter the seventh grade, although they're still little kids, but they're expected to have a certain level of maturity and experience that the teachers who are licensed for older kids, often, especially the newer ones, just expect. They just expect the kids to be more mature. And that's just not always the case, as many of you parents know. So seventh grade is a pivotal year of change for the students. In the same way that third grade was a pivotal year of change for the students. So often, when you have students who are struggling, you can actually trace it back to third grade and to seventh grade. So think about your own child for a minute and you wonder, hey, how was their third grade school year? Did they start to have problems in the third grade? Was third grade one of those standout years where all of a sudden things were not hunky dory and things started to get more challenging? The answer is probably yes. And that happens again in the seventh grade as the kids are now moving up, getting prepared to get into high school, and they have teachers with different set of kind of expectations for the maturity level of the kids. Not only that, but the students are also presented with more mature reading material, and there is also pressure among their peers to watch more mature movies and what have you. So, um, when we talk about the urban schools, we have to add another level of pressure to these kids, which are pressures to do even more dangerous activities. So, when the kids get into middle school, they get into seventh and eighth grade, there are pressures for boyfriends and girlfriends, like they see on the Disney Channel. There are pressures for kids to experiment with drugs. And you think experimenting with marijuana is all there is, but you'd be surprised the kinds of drugs that are many kids are exposed to, even at school. I'll give you a quick story. So it was the last day of the school year, and I was walking out, and I saw an eighth grader teaching a little sixth, going to seventh grade kid how to huff. That means inhaling aerosol to get high. Now that's horrifying because that could kill you. I mean, that could kill a kid the first time they try it. And here was an eighth grade kid feeling perfectly comfortable teaching a little kid, a little girl, how to get high snuffing aerosol. So imagine um, when you talk about vaping and CBD and all these other factors that these kids are being exposed to, it can be really dangerous. Um, and those also are factors, those social pressures and those social influences that hit the kids in urban schools predominantly, because that's my focus. I'm not saying it doesn't happen everywhere, but I'm focusing on urban schools. So in addition, that's the year when a lot of kids are kind of recruited towards gangs, baby gangs, or I don't know, like gateway gangs or what have you. They start to graffiti um, and other things like that, which tends to be somewhat encouraged by society around some of these kids, which includes other kids in the school, but also some of the older kids at the school, but also some of the adults outside of the school that are engaging with these kids. So when you have a kid who runs into struggles in the third grade and they start to feel like their school's not really as easy as it was, and they work through the fifth grade because the parents are really on top of them, and then they move to middle school, and the parents tend to step back across the board in middle school and let the kids be a little more independent. Um, when the kids lose that kind of parental pressure, uh, and if they're already struggling, they have a really hard time acclimating. They have a nice sixth grade teacher, but they hit that bump at the seventh grade and it can be devastating. So these kids may ultimately enter high school 2 or 3 years behind where they should be. And now you're playing catch up. And now, don't forget, those wonderful, nurturing, kind, beautiful spirits that worked with them when they were small are now looking at them and saying, hey, you're 14 years old. You know better. Let's see what we can do. And the expectations for the kids' maturity level and their ability to handle things kind of ramps up. So, although you will always have nurturing, loving teachers at all levels, when you start to get into high school, you tend to find fewer of them, and that also impacts the student's experience. So, kids who go to these urban public school systems, They have vast challenges, and these challenges have nothing to do with the color of their skin, has nothing to do with the wealth of their family. More and more, it seems to have to do with how much effort the parent puts in and how sustained that effort is, not only throughout elementary school, but also throughout middle school and even into high school. Okay, so you will always see parents who are on top of their kids, who don't just say, "What'd you do in school?" but who are like, "I want to see your work. Let me see your notebooks. Show me what you're doing today," and are really on top of those kids. So those kids are successful. And the parents that step back and aren't really in there to make sure their kids don't get, distracted or off the rails, find themselves many times with kids who are struggling. Now, this is none of these things have anything to do with the child themselves, except possibly, how they cope with the challenges that they've been faced. So a kid can enter the ninth grade 3 years below their reading level, and that is a direct result of losing teachers, only having um, substitute teachers for an entire year because of the turnover at the school and the difficulty recruiting and um, maintaining and retaining teachers at these schools. So, what does all this mean? Does it mean a charter school is a better school? No, it doesn't. And the facts kind of prove that out. A charter school is not necessarily a better school if they can't retain their teachers, if they can't engage the parents and make sure that the whole child is addressed and nurtured and cared for, and somebody's really looking out for that kid. And so our urban schools are struggling. And this is why. So the idea of school choice is great, but does it address the issues that are in the schools? The question is, how can we retain the teachers at the schools? What are the incentives we can give the teachers to stay? Um, and what can we do as parents to make sure that our kids don't go off the rails as they navigate this very complex and sometimes confusing situation? So, from me, teacher at home, to you, parents at home, I just want you to get a feel for this. And as we deal with, right now, we're dealing with COVID and students are learning at home and parents are at home with your kids. If they're in middle school, they still need you. They need you to be on their case. They need you to be looking out for them and making sure you're looking over their shoulder and don't just accept when they say yes, 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 they're on school. You're going to have to put in that time and put in that effort to keep them on track and contact the teachers if you have questions. So that's my take. I've taught in inner city schools and urban schools for over 20 years. Um, And I hope this informs parents about some of the issues that are facing your kids. Can you necessarily make sure your kid doesn't have a substitute teacher all year? Believe me, no principal wants a substitute teacher in the classroom all year. They are actively recruiting and trying to find the best teacher to take care of your kid because every school wants to be the best school on the block, in the city, in the community. Everybody wants to be that blue ribbon gold star school. All principals strive for it, all districts strive for it. And so before we start saying that this is something that has to do with anything other than uh, teacher turnover and uh, social pressures that are facing the kids, let's focus on those issues and we can probably improve our urban schools. Um, but it's going to take your parents because without parents, the schools um, are only half of the picture. Okay. So if you are living in an urban city or in an urban society or in an urban neighborhood and your students are attending a public school or even a charter school or a private school in an urban community, make sure that you are partaking in and keeping on top of your kid because there are just There are just too many stressors that the children are facing. So I hope this was educational. This is Teacher at Home, a little bit about urban schools. I hope you found it educational. Please like, share, subscribe, and if you have something to say, let me know. If you disagree with me, put it in the comments. I'm happy to respond to everything you have to say and hear where you're coming from. Okay? So thank you for watching. Once again, please click subscribe, like, and share this video if you like it, and write a comment if you feel the urge. This is Teacher at Home wishing you a good night.